How awesome is it to worship together? It is so good to be with you here, as well as all of you at home. My name's Miss Tandi, and I'm one of the Grace Kids directors here. So I've got my bike here. Anybody remember what the bike wheel represents? Cycle of the Judges. So we've been learning about this cycle that the Israelites got caught in, where they would turn away from God, A, apostasy, so B, they would fall into bondage to their enemies. When things got bad enough, C, they'd cry out to God. D, he would raise up a deliverer judge. And then E, they would have ease and peace in the land. Well, today, we find out, how does the cycle stop? So let's do a little review. We learned last week when we finished up 1 Samuel 7, Samuel is the judge that God has raised up as their deliverer. And they have ease and peace from the Philistines, their enemies. And Samuel is now traveling through the area, and he teaches the people how to love God, how to worship him. And so they are at peace and ease in the land. But he's getting older. And as he's getting older, the Bible tells us that the Ammonites are a new power in the land. They have a new king. His name is Nahash, and Nahash is threatening Israel. Also, because Samuel is getting older, he has appointed his two sons, Joel and Abijah, to take his place. Only problem, Joel and Abijah do not love God. They do not follow him. They're dishonest. They're unfair. And so the elders and leaders of Israel come to Samuel, and they say, "You were a good judge, but your sons have not followed your example. We don't want them to lead us." Well, that kind of sounds good, right? Let's continue. It says, "We want a king like all the other nations around us." A king. That's a person who would have complete power over them. They would have to obey him completely and all of the laws that he made. Samuel isn't sure what to do, so he prays to God. And this is what God says. "Samuel, they are not rejecting you. They are rejecting me as their king. Give them what they want. But make sure you warn them the rights that an earthly king will have." He says, yeah. So he goes back to them. He says, "You want a king? This is the rights that the king will have. He can come and take your sons and say, 'You have to join my army.' He can come and take your daughters and say, 'You have to work in my palace.' He can come and take your fields. He can come and take your money." They don't listen, and they go, "We still want a king. Give us a king." Meanwhile, in another part of Israel, there is a wealthy man named Kish who has lost his donkeys. And so he sends his son and a servant to go find his donkeys. They search and search and search, can't find his donkeys. Saul is about ready to go back, his son Saul, and he says, "Dad's going to be worried about us. We need to go back." But his servant says, "This village up ahead, I've heard there's a man of God there. Maybe he can help us." So they go to the village, run into the man of God. It's Samuel. God has already spoken to Samuel about Saul. And so Samuel says to Saul, "Your donkeys have been found. Come and have a special feast with me." They have the feast together, and then they talk during that evening. The Bible doesn't tell us what Samuel says, but I imagine that he spent the evening reminding Saul all that God had done for Israel, how good and faithful he had been. The next morning, Samuel tells the servant to go on ahead, but he calls Saul over, and he pours oil onto Saul's head. He says, "Saul, God is choosing you as the first king of Israel." And then he sends him home. Sometime later, the Bible tells us that Samuel gathered together all of Israel. And he says, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I brought Israel out of Egypt, and I rescued you from the power of the Egyptians and all the kingdoms that were oppressing you. But today, you have rejected me as king. You have said to me, 'You must set a king over us.' So now present yourselves before me and I will show you who I choose. So they start presenting, and God makes it clear that it is Saul that he has chosen. But nobody can actually find him. God tells him, go look in the supplies. He's hiding there. So they go back, find him. Sure enough, that's where Saul is. They bring Saul out. They recognize he is taller than all the other men. He's going to be their king. He's going to lead them into battle. And they shout, long live the king. And they are happy. You know, God intended for the Israelites to have a heavenly king. But they rejected that. They didn't want that. And so God gave them Saul. But we know that God is good and perfect. And in our memory passage, we've been learning that his laws, they're perfect, they're true, they're altogether righteous, right? As we continue to learn today in our next verse, it's how the psalmist reminds us we want to desire them. They're more to be desired than gold, than much fine gold. God's ways, more than gold. Then they're sweeter. They're sweeter than honey, even the drippings from the honeycomb. Today, we can all choose to follow Jesus as our King. Each of you can choose to say, I will obey your laws because I know they're perfect. I know they're sweeter and that they're more to be desired than gold. So would you seek after him today?